The moon hung low in the sky, a pale, watchful eye in the darkness. The old Pacific Highway stretched out before them, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the dense, shadowy forest. The road was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. The headlights of the car cut through the gloom, revealing nothing but an endless stretch of road ahead. Max, gripping the steering wheel tightly, squinted into the darkness. He was used to late-night drives, but there was something different about this one. The highway had a reputation. Stories passed around in whispers about ghostly figures, cars disappearing without a trace, and travelers who were never seen again. But Max wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. Not until tonight. As he drove, the radio began to crackle, static filling the car. Max reached for the dial, twisting it to find a clear station, but all he got was more static. He frowned and switched it off, preferring the silence. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, oppressive, as if the night itself was pressing in on him. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Max's heart jumped into his throat as he slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, the car skidding to a halt just inches from where the figure stood. It was a woman, pale and thin, her long dark hair hanging in matted strands around her face. She wore a tattered white dress, the kind you'd see in old wedding photos, though it was dirty and torn as if she'd been wandering for years. Max rolled down the window, his hands trembling. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman slowly turned to face him, and Max's blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness, and her mouth opened in a soundless scream. The air grew colder, and Max felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to look away, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes from the horrifying figure. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished, leaving only the cold night air in her wake. Max's hands were shaking as he put the car back in gear and sped away, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out behind him. But the fear lingered, a creeping dread that told him this was just the beginning. The old Pacific Highway had claimed another victim, and Max knew that he was in for the most terrifying night of his life. Max wasn't the superstitious type. He was a rational, down-to-earth guy who believed in facts, not fairy tales. But there was something about the old Pacific Highway that made even the most level-headed people uneasy. It was an old road, one that had seen better days, now mostly forgotten by the world as newer, faster routes were built. But for those who still traveled it, the highway was a place of unsettling mystery, a place where the past seemed to linger just out of sight. The stories had been around for as long as anyone could remember. They were the kind of tales you heard around campfires or at sleepovers, stories meant to spook you just before bedtime. Ghostly hitchhikers that vanished when you looked away, phantom cars that chased you only to disappear when you reached a certain point, and strange lights that floated in the trees. These were just some of the tales that made the old Pacific Highway infamous. But it was the legend of the White Lady that was the most terrifying of all. As the story went, many years ago, a young bride was on her way to her wedding when tragedy struck. Her car spun out of control on a rainy night, and she crashed into the dense woods off the side of the highway. She was never found, at least not alive. Some say she still wanders the road, searching for her lost groom, appearing to drivers in the dead of night, her ghostly form a warning to those who dare travel her path. Max had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the small town nearby had. But he had never put much stock in them. After all, it was just an old road, nothing more. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the further he drove, the more he felt as if he was being watched. He wasn't alone, either. His younger sister, Lily, sat in the passenger seat, her eyes wide as she stared out the window into the dark forest. She was quiet, too quiet, which was unusual for her. Normally, she would be chatting away, her energy filling the car with life, but tonight she was silent, her face pale. "Lily, you okay?" Max asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded slowly, but didn't turn to look at him. "Do you think the stories are true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Max hesitated, not wanting to scare her more than she already was. "Nah, they're just stories. People like to make things up to explain the unexplainable." But even as he said it, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 11:45 p.m. Almost midnight. The witching hour, he thought, and a shiver ran down his spine. "We'll be home soon," he added, more to reassure himself than his sister. But as the car continued down the winding road, Max couldn't help but feel that they were driving deeper into a nightmare, one that they might not escape. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, each turn leading deeper into the darkness. Max's unease grew with every passing mile. He couldn't shake the ghostly woman's image from his mind, her hollow eyes, her soundless scream. It was as if her presence had latched onto him, lingering in the shadows, waiting. Lily shifted in her seat, glancing nervously at her brother. "Max, do you think we're lost?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Max forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "No, we're not lost. The GPS shows we're on the right track. We should be home soon." But the GPS hadn't updated in the last few miles, and the road signs had grown sparse, the familiar markers of civilization fading into the darkness. Max tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his gut, but it was becoming harder with each passing minute. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it again. The woman. She was standing by the side of the road, her white dress glowing faintly in the headlights. Max's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He hit the brakes instinctively, but when he looked again, she was gone. Lily noticed his sudden movement and followed his gaze. "What is it? Did you see something?" Max shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear that was slowly creeping up on him. "No, it's nothing. Probably just a trick of the light." But Lily wasn't convinced. "Max, I saw her too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The woman in white. She was there, and then she wasn't." Max's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew something was wrong, very wrong. "We're just tired, Lily. It's been a long day, and our minds are playing tricks on us." Lily didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. She knew, just as Max did, that what they had seen wasn't a figment of their imagination. The car continued down the winding road, the forest on either side closing in, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across the asphalt. The air inside the car grew colder, and Max noticed his breath fogging up the windshield, despite the heater being on full blast. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the sense of dread was becoming overwhelming. Then, the radio, which had been silent since the static earlier, suddenly crackled to life. A low, distorted voice filled the car, repeating a single word over and over: "Turn back, turn back, turn back." Max's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the radio dial, trying to switch it off, but the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Lily covered her ears, her face pale with fear. "Make it stop, Max. Make it stop." Finally, with a sharp twist of the dial, Max silenced the radio, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Something didn't want them on this road. Max pulled over to the side of the highway, the car idling as he tried to gather his thoughts. The forest loomed around them, the shadows deep and impenetrable. He turned to Lily, who was trembling in her seat. "We're not alone out here, are we?" Lily asked, her voice shaky. Max wanted to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be fine, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew they couldn't stay on this road. Not if they wanted to make it out alive. "We need to find a way out of here," Max said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We'll turn around and head back the way we came. There's got to be a turnoff or something we missed." Lily nodded, her eyes wide with terror. Let's just get out of here, Max. Please. Max shifted the car into reverse, his hands shaking as he turned the wheel. But as the car began to move, the headlights illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road, directly in their path, was the woman in white. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to bore into Max's soul, and her mouth twisted into a ghastly smile. Max's hands froze on the wheel as the car rolled to a stop, the engine idling as if unsure whether to move forward or flee. Lily screamed a high-pitched, terrified sound that pierced the night. Max snapped out of his daze, his foot slamming down on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, the woman vanishing just before they reached her, leaving nothing but the empty road ahead. But the fear didn't vanish with her. It stayed with them, a palpable presence in the car as they sped down the highway, desperate to escape whatever horrors lay in wait. Max's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel, the car speeding down the deserted highway. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of his vision, and every rustle of leaves, every creak of the old road, sent shivers down his spine. He had no idea where they were going, all he knew was that they had to get away from whatever was haunting this cursed road. Lily sat beside him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't said a word since they'd seen the woman again, but Max could feel her terror radiating off her in waves. It was the kind of fear that settled deep in your bones, the kind that made your heart race and your breath come in short, ragged gasps. Max, Lily finally whispered, her voice trembling. What if we can't get out? What if we're trapped here? Max didn't have an answer. The thought had crossed his mind, but he couldn't bear to say it out loud. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't moved since 11:45 p.m. It was as if time itself had frozen, trapping them in this endless nightmare. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending tunnel of darkness. Max's eyes were starting to burn from staring into the blackness, searching for any sign of an escape. But there was nothing, no lights, no houses, no other cars. Just the road and the forest, and the oppressive sense of something watching them from the shadows. Then, out of the darkness, a sign loomed into view, its letters barely visible in the dim light. Max slowed the car, squinting to read it as they passed. Welcome to Clearwater, it read, the words barely legible under a thick layer of grime. Max frowned. Clearwater was a small town, but it was supposed to be miles away from the old Pacific Highway. How had they ended up here? Clearwater? How did we get here? Lily asked, her voice filled with confusion and fear. I don't know, Max replied, shaking his head. But maybe there's someone in town who can help us. At least we're not alone anymore. As they drove into the town, the streets were eerily quiet. No lights shone in the windows of the small houses lining the road, and there wasn't a single person in sight. The town looked abandoned, as if everyone had simply vanished. Max pulled the car to a stop in the middle of the main street, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was overwhelming, pressing in on him from all sides. He turned to Lily, who was staring out the window, her eyes wide with fear. Stay here, Max said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm going to check it out. Lily grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. No, Max. Don't leave me alone. What if she comes back? Max hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but stay close. They stepped out of the car, the night air cold against their skin. The town was deathly silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under their feet. Max's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, but there was nothing. Just empty streets and darkened windows. As they walked down the main street, Max noticed something strange. The buildings, though old and worn, were all intact, as if they had been well maintained. But there was no sign of recent activity, no tire tracks on the road, no footprints in the dust. It was as if the town had been preserved in time, untouched by the outside world. They approached the town center, where a small park sat surrounded by a few shops and a church. A large oak tree stood in the middle of the park, its branches twisted and gnarled. Max felt a chill as he looked at it. There was something unnatural about the tree, something that made his skin crawl. "Max, look," Lily whispered, pointing toward the church. Max followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. The church's large wooden doors were slightly ajar, and from inside came a faint, flickering light. He swallowed hard, fear gripping his heart. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. They walked toward the church, each step heavier than the last. As they reached the entrance, Max pushed the door open, the old wood creaking ominously. Inside, the church was dark, except for the faint glow of candles flickering at the altar. Max and Lily stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and something else, something that smelled like decay. The candles on the altar flickered, casting long shadows across the pews. Max's eyes were drawn to the front of the church, where a figure stood in the shadows. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face hidden in the darkness. "Hello?" Max called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Can you help us?" The man didn't respond, didn't move. He just stood there, silent and still. Max took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please, we're lost. We need help." Finally, the man moved. He stepped forward into the light, and Max felt his breath catch in his throat. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were dark, empty pits, just like the woman they had seen on the road. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and hollow. "This place is cursed. You must leave before it's too late." Max swallowed hard, fear clawing at his insides. "We've been trying to leave, but we can't find a way out. The road, it just keeps going." The man nodded slowly, his expression grim. "The highway is cursed. It traps those who wander too far, who don't heed the warnings. The spirits here, they are restless, bound to this place by tragedy and loss. They won't let you go easily." Lily clutched Max's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do? How do we get out?" The man looked at them, his dark eyes filled with sorrow. "There is a way, but it's dangerous. You must face the phantoms, confront the spirits that haunt this highway. Only then can you break the curse and find your way home." Max's heart raced as he looked at the man, then at Lily. They had no choice. They had to find a way out of this nightmare, and if that meant confronting the ghosts that haunted this place, then so be it. "Tell us what we have to do," Max said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The man nodded. "Follow the road to the old bridge. There, you will find the heart of the curse. But be warned, once you begin, there is no turning back." Max nodded, determination hardening his resolve. He glanced at Lily, who nodded in return. They were in this together, and they would face whatever horrors awaited them on the old Pacific Highway. With a final glance at the man, Max and Lily turned and walked out of the church, the door creaking shut behind them. The night was colder now, the darkness deeper, but they had a plan. They would face the phantoms, break the curse, and find their way home. The road leading to the old bridge was shrouded in an unnatural fog, the mist curling around the car like ghostly fingers. Max's heart pounded in his chest, each thud echoing the fear gnawing at his insides. Lily sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her hands clutching the edge of her seat. Neither of them spoke, the gravity of what lay ahead was too overwhelming. The man from the church had warned them, once they began, there would be no turning back. The bridge, he said, was the heart of the curse, the place where the spirits were most powerful. It was here that they would have to face the phantoms, confront the horrors that had haunted the highway for decades. As they approached the bridge, the fog grew thicker, the world around them fading into a murky gray. The headlights barely penetrated the mist, revealing only the twisted, broken remains of the old wooden bridge. It looked ancient, as if it had been standing for centuries, its planks rotting and warped, the railings hanging by a thread. The river below was invisible, swallowed by the fog, but Max could hear the faint sound of rushing water, cold and unforgiving. He stopped the car at the edge of the bridge, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "This is it," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lily nodded, swallowing hard. "What do we do now?" Max glanced at her, then back at the bridge. "We go across. We face whatever's waiting for us on the other side." They stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at their skin. The fog swirled around them, thickening with every step they took toward the bridge. The old wood creaked under their weight, groaning as if warning them to turn back, but there was no turning back now. They were committed. As they reached the middle of the bridge, the fog parted slightly, revealing a figure standing at the far end. It was the woman in white, her tattered dress billowing in the unseen wind, her dark hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Her hollow eyes locked onto Max and Lily, and she began to move toward them, her steps slow and deliberate. Max felt the air grow colder, his breath coming out in white puffs. He forced himself to stand his ground, his mind racing. They had to confront her, face her head on. But how? "Why are you doing this?" Max called out, his voice echoing in the mist. "What do you want from us?" The woman didn't answer. She continued to move closer, her empty eyes fixed on them, her expression one of eternal sorrow. Lily's voice trembled as she spoke, "Max, I'm scared." Max reached out and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Stay with me, Lily. We'll get through this." The woman was only a few feet away now, her presence overwhelming, the air around her crackling with cold energy. Max could feel the fear clawing at him, trying to drag him down, but he refused to let it take hold. He had to stay strong, for Lily, for both of them. "Please," Max said, his voice cracking with desperation. "We just want to go home. Let us go." For a moment, the woman stopped, her empty eyes searching Max's face. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed to the far end of the bridge. The fog parted slightly, revealing a second figure standing there, a man in a dark suit, his face shadowed but unmistakably the same as the man they had seen in the church. Max's heart skipped a beat. "It's him, the man from the church." The woman in white stepped aside, her gaze shifting from Max to the man at the end of the bridge. Her expression softened, the sorrow in her eyes deepening. Max realized with a jolt of understanding, she wasn't trying to harm them. She was trying to guide them, to help them understand. "Lily, stay close to me," Max whispered, his grip tightening on his sister's hand. They walked slowly toward the man, the fog swirling around them, the air heavy with tension. As they approached, the man stepped forward, his dark eyes filled with the same sorrow they had seen in the woman. "You have come far," the man said, his voice low and mournful. "But the curse of this highway is not easily broken." Max swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "What do we have to do?" The man looked at the woman, then back at Max and Lily. "The spirits of this highway are trapped in a cycle of despair, bound by their grief and loss. To break the curse, you must show them the way to peace." "How?" Lily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man's gaze softened. "By remembering them, by acknowledging their pain. They are not just ghosts, they were once people, like you. They need to be seen, to be remembered." Max's heart ached as he looked at the woman in white. Her sorrow, her pain, it was palpable, a wound that had never healed. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. "I see you. I remember you." The woman's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she smiled, a sad, ghostly smile, but a smile nonetheless. The fog around them began to lift, the cold air warming slightly. The man nodded. "You have done well. The spirits of this highway will rest now, and you are free to go." Max and Lily exchanged a look, relief washing over them like a tidal wave. They had done it, they had faced the phantoms, confronted their fears, and survived. As they walked toward the far end of the bridge, the woman in white and the man in the dark suit began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. The fog continued to lift, revealing the road ahead, clear and bright in the first light of dawn. Max and Lily climbed back into the car, their hands still trembling but their hearts lighter. They drove across the bridge, the old wood creaking beneath them, but this time, there was no fear. The curse had been broken, the spirits laid to rest. As they reached the other side of the bridge, the sun began to rise, casting warm, golden light across the highway. The darkness was behind them, and ahead lay the promise of a new day, a day free from the phantoms of the old Pacific Highway. The old Pacific Highway was behind them now, the terrifying events of the night gradually fading like a bad dream. Max and Lily drove in silence, the morning sun casting long shadows across the landscape, painting the world in warm hues that felt almost surreal after the cold, dark nightmare they had just escaped. Max glanced at his sister, who was staring out the window, her eyes tired but no longer filled with fear. He could see the faint smile on her lips, a sign that the weight of the night was beginning to lift. The horrors they had faced seemed almost unbelievable in the light of day, but the memories were all too real, etched into their minds forever. As they finally approached the familiar outskirts of their town, the tension in the car eased, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. They had survived. They had faced the phantoms, broken the curse, and found their way home. But they knew that they would never forget the spirits they had encountered, the woman in white, the sorrowful man, and the other lost souls trapped on that cursed highway. Pulling into their driveway, Max turned off the engine and took a deep breath. The air was fresh, the morning birds chirping as if nothing unusual had happened. But he knew better. The old Pacific Highway was a place of secrets, a place where the past lingered just beneath the surface, waiting for the unsuspecting to wander too close. Lily turned to Max, her voice soft. "Do you think they're at peace now? The spirits?" Max nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think so. We remembered them, acknowledged their pain. That's what they needed." Lily smiled faintly, her eyes still holding a touch of the fear they had faced. "I'm glad it's over." Max reached over and squeezed her hand. "Me too. Let's go inside and get some rest." They stepped out of the car, the warmth of the sun on their backs as they walked toward the house. The nightmare of the old Pacific Highway was behind them, but the experience had changed them both. They had seen a world beyond their own, a world where the past could haunt the present, where sorrow could bind souls to the earth. But they had also seen the power of remembrance, of acknowledging the pain of those who came before. And with that, they had found a way to move forward, leaving the ghosts of the highway behind. As they closed the door behind them, the house seemed to welcome them back with its familiar, comforting presence. They were home, and for now, that was